What if I told you that the grand Victorian mansion, that symbol of refinement and elegance we so admire in period dramas, was held together not by dignity and grace, but by fear, filth, and the raw, bleeding hands of a child you were never meant to see? We picture Victorian life through rose-tinted glasses, silk gowns gliding up marble staircases, gentlemen in tailcoats warming themselves beside crackling fires, crystal chandeliers casting golden light across polished floors. But beneath those shining surfaces existed another world entirely, a world of systematic cruelty so profound that it would make modern labor violations seem merciful by comparison. The true story of Victorian luxury is not found in the drawing room or the library. To understand how that glittering world really functioned, we must descend past the green baize door that separated family from staff, past the housekeeper's orderly domain, past even the bustling kitchen where the cook reigned supreme. We must go to the darkest, dampest corner of the house, the scullery. Here lived a figure who has been almost entirely erased from our collective memory, not because her story was unimportant, but because it was too horrifying for polite society to acknowledge. She was often a child, sometimes no older than 12, stripped of her identity and forced into a life of ceaseless labor that destroyed her body before she reached womanhood. She was the scullery maid, the lowest and most abused servant in the Victorian house, and her story reveals the blood-soaked foundation upon which an entire civilization's comfort was built. Chapter 1. The Fad of Victorian Luxury, a World of Illusions. The Victorian country house was designed as a theater of power, every brick and curtain calculated to project an image of effortless dominance. When guests arrived at a great estate, they entered an atmosphere of pure magic. Fires blazed in marble hearths without anyone ever glimpsing coal being carried. Elaborate meals materialized on dining tables as if summoned by sorcery, 8, 10, sometimes 12 courses appearing with military precision. Baths filled with steaming water in rooms that had no visible plumbing. Dust seemed to vanish from furniture by supernatural means. The ultimate goal of the Victorian domestic machine was to create what historians call invisible service. Comfort manifested as if it were a natural law rather than the product of human labor. This illusion required staggering amounts of human fuel, and the architecture itself was a physical manifestation of class warfare. The house was divided into two sovereign nations. Upstairs, a world of light, leisure, and soft fabrics. Downstairs, a stone-floored, gas-lit underworld operating on brutal discipline and military precision. The famous green baize door was more than a barrier. It was a border crossing between civilization and what the Victorians considered necessary barbarism. In this hidden realm, hierarchy was absolute and merciless. At the top sat the butler and housekeeper, the king and queen of the basement, with their own rooms and china, addressed with respect even by their social betters. Below them ranked the upper servants, footmen, valets, ladies' maids who had the privilege of being seen by the masters. Then came the lower servants, housemaids and kitchen maids, who at least worked in teams and shared camaraderie. And finally, at the very bottom, beneath the floorboards of decency, was the scullery maid. She was the foundation of the pyramid, absorbing all the filth so others could remain clean. If the butler was the CEO of this domestic corporation, she was the machine part ground down until it snapped. Her position wasn't just the lowest. It was deliberately designed to be a repository for all the household's cruelty. A human lightning rod for every frustration that trickled down the rigid social hierarchy. The scullery itself was not merely a workplace but a carefully constructed prison. Usually located in the basement with minimal light from high barred windows, it reeked of wet stone, old grease, and the metallic tang of perpetually dirty water. This stone-lined chamber adjacent to the kitchen was where everything soiled went to be purified. Every plate licked clean by aristocrats, every roasting pan caked with burnt fat, every copper pot blackened by fire. In a world without dishwashers, rubber gloves, or modern degreasers, cleaning wasn't a chore but a physical battle that left permanent scars. But her suffering transcended mere labor. The scullery maid was the one person in the house whom everyone else was permitted to abuse. When the master berated the butler snapped at the footman. The footman was rude to the cook, and the cook, red-faced with stress, would unleash her fury on the scullery maid. She was the emotional sewage system for the entire estate, absorbing toxicity so the machinery of respectability could function smoothly. Her world was one of sensory assault, the sting of caustic soda on open wounds, the suffocating smell of coal smoke mixed with rotting food scraps, the bone-deep ache of standing on stone floors for 18 hours a day. Yet she remained invisible to those whose comfort she purchased with her suffering. If she was carrying coal up the back stairs and heard the rustle of silk approaching, she had to flatten herself against the wall or dive into a cupboard, turning her face away as if her very presence was contamination. The contrast was deliberate and absolute. While the family lived in light and warmth, she existed in damp darkness. While they enjoyed leisure and conversation, she knew only exhausting silence. While they ate elaborate meals from fine china, she consumed scraps from the plates she scrubbed, standing in corners because she wasn't permitted to sit. This wasn't accidental inequality. It was engineered dehumanization, a system that required her degradation to function properly. As you envision that gleaming Victorian hallway now, the polished banister, the spotless tiles, the brass doorknobs that caught the light, ask yourself, how many invisible hours did each shining detail cost? How many scraped knuckles? How much of what we call elegance was really someone else's exhaustion, transformed through architectural alchemy into the appearance of effortless grace? Chapter 2. The Invisible World. Servants Behind the Curtain. The scullery maid's day began in the pitch darkness before dawn, usually at 4:30 in the morning, when even the butler slept soundly in his private quarters. She woke in a narrow cot in the scullery itself, or in a cupboard-like room that doubled as storage space. The air so cold her breath formed white clouds in the darkness. Her bare feet touched stone floors that burned with cold, and there was no time to linger. The heart of the house needed restarting. Her first battle was with the kitchen range, a massive cast-iron beast that required constant feeding and maintenance. Before the cook descended to her domain, the scullery maid had to rake out yesterday's dead ashes, haul heavy scuttles of coal, and coax the fire back to roaring life. But lighting it wasn't enough. She had to clean it through a process called black leading that epitomized the toxic nature of her existence. Black leading required mixing powdered graphite with water or vinegar to create a paste that she applied to every iron surface, buffing until it shone like a mirror. The toxic dust invaded her nose, lungs, and skin pores. If the cook found a single dull spot, the punishment was swift and physical: slaps, hair pulling, or blows with wooden spoons. This heavy, sweaty work was performed by candlelight in the pre-dawn darkness, her young body already aching before the household stirred. By 6:30, when other servants began their day, she had completed a morning's worth of brutal labor. Then came the water, gallons upon gallons that she pumped, carried, and heated in massive copper jugs that strained her developing spine. The Victorian obsession with hot water meant constant hauling, ensuring that when the cook arrived, the boilers were full and steaming, ready to support the day's elaborate meal preparations. But the defining horror of her existence was the sink, a deep stone trough where she spent most of her waking life. In a large country house, the volume of dirty dishes was astronomical. A single dinner party could generate hundreds of items: silver platters, china plates, crystal glasses, copper saucepans, iron skillets, each requiring individual attention and specialized cleaning techniques. The cleaning agents of the Victorian era were instruments of torture disguised as household necessities. She used washing soda crystals, highly alkaline and caustic substances that stripped natural oils from skin. For scouring pots, she used sand, jagged rough particles that abraded tissue while removing burnt-on grease. Taking handfuls of soda and sand with rough rags, she scrubbed heavy copper pots until the metal gleamed, her hands paying the price for each moment of reflected light. The physical toll was immediate and cumulative. Within weeks of starting work, her hands became red, raw, cracked landscapes of pain. The salt from food and caustic soda seeped into these fissures, creating constant, throbbing agony. This condition was so common it earned the name washerwoman's hands, but for scullery maids, the damage was far more severe, because their hands were their only tools, and they could never rest. Dominating this world of steam and suffering was the cook, a figure who embodied the psychological complexity of the servant hierarchy. Under immense pressure to perform culinary miracles for the family upstairs, cooks often transformed stress into tyranny, with the scullery maid as their primary target. "Hurry up, girl. You've missed a spot. You clumsy fool." These phrases echoed constantly through the scullery, accompanied by the crash of thrown pans and the sharp crack of wooden spoons against young flesh. The scullery maid absorbed this abuse in enforced silence, forbidden from speaking back or defending herself. She was assigned the most revolting tasks: plucking poultry, skinning rabbits, gutting fish. She stood for hours covered in blood and feathers, her hands freezing in cold water, preparing ingredients that would later grace fine china while she subsisted on table scraps. The psychological dimension of her suffering was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. She existed in a state of enforced invisibility, forbidden from being seen by the family whose comfort she enabled. If she heard silk rustling on the stairs while carrying coal, she had to dive into cupboards or press herself against walls, face turned away as if her presence was pollution. This systematic dehumanization was designed to make her disappear even from her own consciousness, to transform her from a person into a function. Imagine the mind of a 13-year-old girl in this situation, exhausted, in constant pain, and repeatedly told she was worthless. She had no friends, for upper servants maintained their status by emphasizing distance from her, and she had no time for human connection. She was a ghost operating the machinery of luxury, while being ground to dust by its gears, her youth and health sacrificed daily on the altar of upper-class respectability. Yet as evening approached and gas lamps flickered to life throughout the house above, her ordeal was far from over. The dinner party, that pinnacle of Victorian social ritual, was about to begin, and for the scullery maid, this meant descent into a special kind of hell, where the family's performance of effortless elegance would exact its heaviest toll on her young body. Chapter 3. The Rituals of the Elite: How Etiquette Became a Prison. While the morning was a marathon of heavy lifting, and the afternoon a steady grind of maintenance, evening transformed the scullery into a battlefield, where Victorian social rituals waged war against human endurance. Upstairs, the dining room became a stage for prosperity. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over pristine white linen, and the air filled with genteel conversation and the musical clinking of silver. But every course that left the kitchen was a ticking bomb of labor for the invisible girl below. The Victorian dinner party represented the pinnacle of social performance, a ritual of staggering complexity and consumption. 10 courses were standard for important occasions: soup, fish, entrees, roasts, game, salads, sweets, savories, dessert, and coffee. Each course demanded its own specialized plates, cutlery, and serving dishes. In the kitchen, each course required specific pots, pans, and preparation vessels, all of which would cascade into the scullery as dirty, greasy monuments to upper-class appetite. As footmen in pristine livery marched food upstairs in military formation, the detritus of culinary artistry began mounting in the scullery like an avalanche of metal and porcelain. This was what kitchen staff called copper hell. Mountains of heavy pots that were excellent heat conductors, but notorious for their difficulty to clean. They tarnished quickly, food stuck to their surfaces like cement, and they required specialized techniques to restore their mirror-like finish. The scullery maid worked at fever pitch, surrounded by towers of greasy metal that seemed to multiply faster than she could clean them. The water in her stone sink quickly transformed into brown, oily sludge, but there was rarely time to change it. She plunged her raw, bleeding hands into this filth repeatedly, fishing for cutlery, scrubbing copper with abrasive sand until her knuckles bled freely into the dishwater. Steam from boiling water mixed with smoke from the range and the acrid smell of unwashed bodies, creating a suffocating atmosphere that made breathing difficult. The timing was merciless. Sometimes the kitchen ran short of specific pans mid-preparation. The cook would scream for a saucepan currently buried at the bottom of the greasy sink. The maid had to retrieve it, scour it to gleaming perfection, rinse it, and dry it in seconds, handing it over while still scalding hot. A moment's delay could result in physical punishment or the threat of dismissal. A death sentence for a girl with no references and no family to return to. This connection between upstairs leisure and downstairs torture reveals the true psychology of Victorian society. Every refinement of etiquette directly translated to increased suffering below. The rule that one must never use the same fork for fish and meat meant double the washing up. The demand that sauces must be served in separate boats created more intricate, impossible to clean vessels. The obsession with spotless presentation multiplied the labor exponentially. Each gleaming surface represented hours of scrubbing by hands that would never heal. The architectural design of Victorian houses enforced this brutal separation with scientific precision. Elaborate systems of back staircases, hidden corridors, and below-ground passages ensured that servants moved throughout the house like ghosts, never disturbing the illusion of effortless comfort. The scullery, buried deepest in this underground maze, was designed to be a black hole from which no evidence of labor could escape. But the evening's cruelty extended beyond dishes. The scullery maid was responsible for slops, Victorian euphemism for liquid waste. Chamber pots from servants' quarters, buckets of dirty water from cleaning, kitchen refuse, and worse, all required emptying and sanitizing. In an era before universal plumbing, waste management was manual labor that fell to the lowest servant. She hauled buckets of human waste through dark corridors, emptied them in outdoor privies, then scrubbed the containers clean for reuse. The isolation during these hellish hours was profound and deliberate. While the kitchen buzzed with activity and camaraderie, footmen joking with housemaids, kitchen maids gossiping while chopping vegetables, the scullery was a dead end of solitary suffering. She faced the wall, faced the sink, faced the darkness, too dirty and degraded for human contact. The grime of her work became a social barrier as impermeable as the class distinctions that governed the house above. There was tragic irony in the fact that the person responsible for the household's hygiene was forced to live in squalor. She often had no access to proper washing facilities, cleaning herself in a basin with cold water if energy remained. Her apron was perpetually stained with soot and grease, her hair lank with steam and smoke. This visible dirtiness made her a target for contempt and justified her treatment in the minds of those who benefited from her labor. As the dinner party wound down and guests moved to the drawing room for brandy and cigars, the scullery maid's night was far from over. The washing up could continue until midnight or beyond, thousands of items requiring individual attention. Every plate had to be perfect, every glass spotless, every pot gleaming. If anything was chipped or stained, the cost came from her pitiful wages, often just a few pounds per year, barely enough for survival, even in an era of low prices. By the time she collapsed onto her narrow cot, it might be 1 a.m. She had worked for 20 hours, her body pushed beyond human limits. Her hands throbbed with infected cuts, her back screamed from constant bending, her legs were swollen from standing on stone, and she knew with terrifying certainty that in 3.5 hours the cycle would begin again. Chapter 4. The Dark Side of Wealth, Power, Misery, and the Price of Comfort. We often imagine the Victorian servant system as a career ladder, where ambition and hard work led to advancement. The kitchen maid who becomes a cook, the footman who rises to butler. For some, this fairy tale held true. But for the scullery maid, the ladder was missing its bottom rungs, creating not opportunity but a carefully constructed trap designed to consume young lives in service to upper-class comfort. The scullery was a dead end by design. The work was so exhausting it left no time for self-improvement or skill acquisition. While a kitchen maid might learn cooking techniques by observation, and a housemaid might master organization and fabric care, the scullery maid learned only endurance of pain. Unless a benevolent cook took extraordinary pity and decided to teach her, a rare occurrence that risked the cook's own position, she could remain trapped for years, her body deteriorating with each passing month, while her mind was systematically broken by isolation and abuse. The physical toll was catastrophic and permanent. Constant dampness led to rheumatism and arthritis in teenagers. Heavy lifting caused hernias and uterine prolapse in girls whose bodies were still developing. Lack of sunlight and inadequate nutrition, often consisting of literal table scraps and refuse, resulted in anemia, rickets, and stunted growth. These children were physically destroyed before reaching adulthood, their bodies bearing permanent testimony to the cost of Victorian elegance. But the physical damage was only the visible surface of a deeper horror. The Victorian home was a private kingdom where law stopped at the front door and the master's word was absolute. Inside these domestic kingdoms, physical abuse was normalized as correction. A clip around the ear, a slap across the face, or a beating with a broom handle were considered appropriate responses to perceived failures. There was no oversight, no protection, no recourse for a girl whose only crime was exhaustion or human error. The sexual vulnerability of scullery maids represents one of history's most systematically ignored atrocities. Positioned at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy, these girls were considered fair game for predatory men throughout the household, from the master's sons to visiting guests to upper servants, who used sexual dominance to reinforce their own precarious status. If the young master cornered a scullery maid in a dark pantry, she had no voice to scream with and no authority to appeal to. Complaints would result in immediate dismissal for loose morals and encouraging improper advances. If pregnancy resulted from these assaults, and it frequently did, the girl was instantly dismissed without references, cast onto the street with nothing. The fallen woman narrative of Victorian literature often began in basement sculleries, where children were systematically violated by the very people who employed them. The perpetrators faced no consequences. Indeed, their behavior was often tacitly encouraged as a way of maintaining absolute power over the most vulnerable members of society. The psychological impact of this constant vulnerability created a culture of terror that extended far beyond individual households. These girls lived in perpetual hypervigilance, learning to make themselves invisible, to anticipate violence, to accept degradation as natural. They were trained to believe they were worthless, not just economically, but as human beings deserving of basic dignity and protection. The system was designed to strip them of identity itself. They were often not called by their names but simply referred to as scullery, or, if there were multiple girls, second scullery or third scullery. Their personhood was erased, replaced by their function, a classic technique of dehumanization that made it easier for employers to ignore the suffering occurring under their own roofs. Consider the staggering hypocrisy this reveals about Victorian moral consciousness. The same lady of the house who wept over Dickens' novels about orphaned children, who organized charity drives for London's poor, who attended church services about Christian compassion, simultaneously employed a system of child abuse in her own basement. The same gentleman who spoke eloquently about British civilization's moral superiority over savage nations was perfectly comfortable with the systematic destruction of children for his domestic convenience. This moral blindness wasn't accidental, but carefully cultivated. Victorian society developed elaborate justifications for the servant system that sound chillingly familiar to modern ears. These girls should be grateful for the opportunity to work. Without service, they would face starvation or the workhouse. Their suffering built character and taught valuable lessons about industry and submission. The economic system that created such desperate poverty that children had to choose between abuse and death was never questioned. Only the victims were blamed for their circumstances. The scullery maid represents the ultimate cost of Victorian aesthetics. When we admire the beautiful architecture, refined manners, and stunning fashions of the era, we must ask, what was the human price of that beauty? The pristine cleanliness of those grand houses was purchased with destroyed hands. The elaborate meals were bought with exhausted children. The leisure of the family was enabled by what can only be called slavery, differing from plantation bondage, mainly in that it occurred within the supposed sanctuary of the domestic sphere. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, and the First World War began shattering old social orders, the supply of scullery maids finally began drying up. Girls found work in factories where, despite long hours and dangerous conditions, they at least had freedom after shifts ended and wages that allowed independent survival. They voted with their feet, fleeing the damp basements of the aristocracy en masse. The servant problem, as the wealthy called this exodus, was simply the working class's refusal to be treated as subhuman any longer. But the ghost of the scullery maid haunts us still. She represents a fundamental truth about human nature and social organization that we prefer not to acknowledge, that luxury often requires invisible suffering, that comfort frequently depends on the systematic exploitation of the powerless, and that societies can convince themselves that even the most horrific abuse is natural, necessary, and morally justified. When we walk through preserved Victorian estates today, admiring the craftsmanship and grandeur, we are guided to see only the winner's story. But history belongs not just to those who sat at the polished tables. It belongs equally to those who scrubbed the floors beneath them. The scullery maid forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own lives and choices. When we enjoy cheap goods, convenient services, or seamless experiences, do we dare to ask who pays the hidden cost? Who is the scullery maid of the modern world? Her life was not a romantic struggle, but a tragedy of enforced silence. She lived in damp darkness, worked in isolation, and died in obscurity. But by telling her story, by acknowledging her pain and honoring her labor, we give her the one thing Victorian society denied her: recognition of her fundamental human dignity. The next time you watch a period drama and sigh at the elegance of the costumes and the wit of the dialogue, remember the girl in the basement. Remember the sand and the soda, the bleeding hands and the stone-cold floors. Remember that behind every gleaming surface was a child whose suffering made that shine possible. Was the beauty of the Victorian era worth its foundation of misery? Or was the entire age merely a gilded cage, shining on the outside but filled with rot within? These questions matter because they force us to examine not just the past, but the present. Not just Victorian society, but our own. The Scullery Maid's story is ultimately about power, about how societies organize suffering to maintain comfort, and about the human capacity to ignore atrocity when it serves our interests. Her ghost demands that we look beyond the polished surfaces of our own world and ask, whose invisible labor supports our comfort? Whose suffering do we choose not to see? And what would it mean to truly see them? Not as functions or statistics, but as human beings deserving of dignity, protection, and hope. Share your thoughts about what surprised you most in this hidden history. Did you know about the brutal reality behind the downstairs world? How does this story change your understanding of Victorian society, and perhaps of our own? Subscribe to uncover more forgotten voices from history, because the stories we choose to remember shape the world we choose to create.